Conformity refers to the changing of one's behavior due to the real or imagined influence of others. It's fairly easy to consider the real influence of others. People can directly apply force, causing us to change our own behaviors. Just as real, however, is what we imagine others will perceive in regard to our own behaviors, and we can actually modify our own behaviors based on this sort of imagination we have of other people's opinions or beliefs about our actions, and this too can ultimately cause us to conform to certain types of groups or norms. So some examples of conformity: during the civil rights movement, they were the Freedom Riders. They were trained in a sort of non-violent, non-aggression style of protest, and much like some of Gandhi's teachings, they were taught ultimately in passive acceptance, which is just, even when they too were treated violently, to not respond in kind. This of course resulted in many of them being beaten and assaulted, and some actually even killed by not just average folk, but even some sheriffs in the South, which is pretty crazy to think about. Anyhow, they as a monument to their training and solidarity, maintained this sort of vow of non-aggression, and for a long time it was just pretty unbelievable. And of course, new recruits joined over time, and many of these new recruits began to just adopt those behaviors that these now more senior members who had originally gotten the training had, and many of them would take on that style of behavior without necessarily getting any specific training in that regard. Another example, maybe somewhat darker, is the Heaven's Gate cult. Here it was another cult that ended up with a large mass suicide, which is always pretty rough when these things happen. But here again, you see that an entire group of people collectively had some idea. In this case, it was that they needed to shed their sort of corporal bodies so that they could be beamed up or taken by an alien spacecraft following in the Halley's-Bopp comet's wake. Whatever one tends to think about those types of beliefs, it still remains that an entire group of people, 40 people in this case, I can't really say this, but that's like half of this class, if just a group like that all decided collectively together that this life wasn't worth it, and that one offered by these aliens is so much better, and to believe so strongly that this is true, that you could take your own life. It's pretty unbelievable to think about. Now, this is probably something to keep in mind for the rest of this lecture. One of the first things we tend to do when we come across this type of information is to think about these people as somehow different than the average person, that the Freedom Riders were more noble and sort of stoic and honorable than the average person, and the Heaven's Gate cult people, let's say, tended to be maybe more gullible or of lower intellect, let's say, than the average person. And this is just not really the case. Overwhelmingly, it has been found that many of these situations in which these groups do either unbelievably amazing things or unbelievably strange and horrifying things, more often than not, they're made up of average people like most of us who are put in extreme circumstances and have a tremendous amount of social pressure applied to them, and this has an unbelievable impact on our behavior. And that's basically what we're going to talk about for this whole lecture. So first of all, we'll talk about informational social influence, and this is ultimately going to be talking about how we will conform to other people's behavior because we believe that they are genuine and viable sources of information. And so by copying their behavior, what we're ultimately doing is assuming that they have thought about whatever their actions are, and we will sort of trust that they have done a good job or due diligence, let's say, and that in now copying their behavior, it is ultimately equivalent to us having thought about whatever the situation happens to be. So specifically here, we're going to refer to this as a change in behavior that results from relying on people as a source of information. So this does happen most often when situations are ambiguous. If you know already what it is that you are supposed to do, would like to do, or going to do, you don't really need to rely on somebody else to try and figure out what to do. But if a situation is ambiguous and you're unsure of what the correct action is, we are much more likely to use others as a source of information. And we do because, as I mentioned before, we have this belief that they have probably thought about why they're doing whatever it is they're doing, and therefore we can just safely copy them. And that actually works really, really well in many, many cases. So just imagine coming into a library or going into a church, for example. We tend to automatically adopt a more silent pose, a certain sort of deference to the building and the situation. And yes, many of us are socialized to act that way, and we know that's how we're supposed to be. But there's something also about all of the people all acting in this sort of unified way that even if you're not 100% sure how you're supposed to behave, it is pretty obvious if you just look around what the correct sort of behavior is in that environment. And in those cases, other people are a good source of information. Another could be, on average, in emergencies, probably a good idea to listen to firemen, for example, or first responders. They probably know more about the situation than the average person. This, of course, can get problematic, however, because you could maybe have somebody else who is just randomly doing things, and copying their behavior is probably not the best in times of crisis. So a few terms to know before we move on. Private acceptance refers to the idea of conforming to other people's behavior out of a genuine belief that what they are doing or saying is right. This is now when I change my behavior in line now with somebody else, and I'm doing so because I genuinely believe the merit of changing my behavior. So if I was to say I am no longer going to smoke cigarettes, and I have somehow gleaned that this is going to be better for my health, and I believe it, and I now also believe it's okay to get help with quitting programs, for example, and now I genuinely embark upon the mission, and over time I'm able to successfully stop smoking. This would be an example of private acceptance. I see the value of changing my behavior and am now so doing. Public compliance is a little bit different. It refers to conforming to other people's behavior publicly without necessarily believing in what the other people are doing or saying. So a very common example of this, using the smoking also, would be smoking as a teenager. Many times you get caught by your parents and they will say, please never smoke again. Well, maybe they won't say it so nicely. And we will okay and not smoke. And then we try and play this complex dance of continuing to smoke without getting caught. So you smoke when you're not around, and you cover up the scent in any which way you can, and all kinds of shenanigans ensue. But ultimately now what's happening is there are certain situations in which we do not smoke. So we're now conforming to this sort of pressure of don't smoke, but we smoke at other times, and it's only specifically where we do not. So this just shows that in that sort of quote unquote public setting, when we are with these others who are applying influence on us, we modify our behavior, but not necessarily when we are by ourselves. Now we're going to talk about an experiment on the next page, so please note this autokinetic effect, and this refers to the idea, or ultimately the motion, when you stare at a light, a bright light especially, that is in a completely dark environment. A nice picture to keep in mind of this would be, imagine a very, very dark sheet that was very large, so that if you looked straight without moving your head, it's all you could see. And then there was a tiny little hole cut out of it with a really bright light behind it. The autokinetic effect refers to the motion we perceive in those lights that are on a uniformly dark background. So because there is nothing else to sort of give us a frame of reference, we tend to see this light wobble. And this is probably largely due to the idea that our eyes also are constantly moving around to be able to allow us to continually perceive still things. But that's tangential to this conversation. A thing or a place where you have probably witnessed this in your own life would just be occasionally when we look at stars and you only see a few stars in the night sky, and otherwise it is mostly dark around. Those stars seem to dance ever so small, or little, I guess. Demonstrating informational social influence. The following situation was chosen due to its ambiguity, so the experimental setup was dealing with the autokinetic effect, and because this is ultimately different for many individuals, that resulted in the ambiguity involved in this situation. Plus, they're not really right answers because most people perceive it as motion in the light when in fact it is stationary. So, in a dark room with a single small point of light, participants came in, they sort of took part in several trials where they saw this dark background with a singular light there, and they estimated the movement for this light. So for example, participant 1 could come in and they would say something like, oh, I think this light is moving back and forth by about 1 to 2 inches. And the next participant could come in and say something as large as, say, oh, I think it's moving between 8 and 10 inches. And then participant 3 comes in and says it's 2 inches, and so on and so forth. And everybody sort of or not everybody, but all of the participants come in and they give ultimately their estimates, and this gets marked as the baseline for each of these participants, or how much sort of wobble they are perceiving. Now, a few days later, they come back and they take part in the second phase of this experiment, where they ultimately do exactly what they did before. They're in a dark room with a singular light in the back with no other frame of reference, and they're trying to estimate the amount of movement that is there in this light. The only difference, however, is this time there are 2 additional participants who are also giving their ratings at the same time as this other participant. So now you have 3 people in this dark room looking at this one light that gives the illusion of movement, and all of them are giving their estimates, and each of them is doing so out loud. Also, hopefully at about the same time. Now, what's crazy is after a few trials, their estimates converged on a single value. Here, let me just turn on a pointer. So here you can see an example of 3 different participants. This green line is one person, the red is another, and this blue is another. And so alone is just the marker of what they estimated when they were by themselves. So this would be their baseline. So you see one participant was like, it's less than an inch, one about 2 inches, and one as much as 7.5. And as they've begun to take trials together, you can see already on the first one, they moved to sort of a cohesive unit as compared to their original baseline. You could ask yourself here, if on the first trial that already happened, did they modulate their answers as soon as they started hearing the response of the people around them? Just something to consider. Anyhow, you can see as the trials progress through this experiment where, a new light is turned on and people are asked, okay, how much is this wobbling, that their response ultimately begun to converge. So here you can see all 3 people are saying, it's a little over 2 inches of wobble in that light, which is pretty nuts if you think about it. But also it makes sense in the form or vein of saying, maybe these other people are seeing it more clearly than I am. They know something I don't. Who knows, really? But ultimately, we're using them as a source of information because it's really hard to have a correct answer in this situation, being as it is very ambiguous, right? There's a light that you're perceiving has movement, even though it actually does not. So the whole thing is illusory and generated by our minds in the first place. So that's about as subjective as you can get. Now, later on, I think it's quite some time later actually, the participants were brought back to take part in another form of the experiment, which ultimately now mirrors what they did originally. So they stand in this room and they give their responses by themselves in this dark room with no background, just this little light. And what's nuts is they still provided estimates that were in line with their group's convergence point when they took part in the second phase of the experiment. And ultimately what this shows us is, here you can, or this indicates a degree of private acceptance, where people actually not only conform to the group's estimate, but they now internalize that estimate as the quote-unquote true amount of movement in that piece of light. And this is a lot of times when we talk about private acceptance, what we mean. And we'll talk about it some more as we go on. And one of the biggest differences between private acceptance and public compliance is private acceptance tends to change our behavior for a very long time and consistently throughout many situations. So, another variable that influences informational social influence and its impact on our behavior is the need to be accurate, I suppose, or the importance of being accurate. Now, here's a task to show this. So a group of participants were asked to pick a perpetrator out of a lineup. So much like how we've seen in the movies, or I suppose in real life too, that you have a group of individuals who are standing in front of this lined board that shows heights, and these are ostensibly photographs, and people are shown a target item, and they're asked now, okay, can you please pick this person out of the lineup? And there are 13 of these trials, so 13 times with 13 different sets of individuals, you're shown a target and you're asked, okay, please pick out that target in this group of people. And this situation was made ambiguous by only showing that target face for half a second. Now, we are actually unbelievably good at processing faces very quickly, but we generally will not be able to remember a vivid and clear image of somebody's face if it is just flashed for half a second on a screen, especially if we're already involved in some type of task that we're doing. Now, this took place with 3 additional people in the room also picking out the perpetrator or the target from this lineup, and these other 3 people, even though they quote unquote pretended to be participants as well, they were accomplices, or they were in on the experiment with the experimenters. And on 7 of the 13 trials, all of them answered who they thought was the target in the lineup, and they gave a unanimous answer, and that unanimous answer was wrong. So just imagining the situation, there I am, I'm standing there, I've just seen a face for half a second, I'm supposed to pick this face out of the 6 people that I'm being shown who are standing in front of me, and I have 3 other people who are going to give their answer before I do, who are also supposedly just random people just like me, who've shown up to take part in an experiment for either credit or money or just scientific curiosity, and they all point out someone different than who I think. And we're just assuming I think that it is the person I saw, and they're all actually giving a response that corresponds to an incorrect person. Okay, so of course you can already probably imagine that we're curious about how often did people, like in this case myself, conform to these other 3 people's unanimous but incorrect response. Well, we'll get to that, but before that, we have to talk about one other thing they manipulated. So they also manipulated, the experimenters that is, the importance of being correct. They did this by telling 1/2 of the participants that their sort of responses and accuracy, their scores in this task, was going to be used to establish sort of new standards and benchmarks by which all subsequent eyewitness testimony would be judged for now and eternity, if you can imagine. Not actually, but just to try and make it seem more salient, important. The other half were told that this was a first attempt to study eyewitness testimony, and the task was still a work in progress. So basically like a beta version of a video game or a piece of software. It's good to give some good feedback, but it doesn't really matter so much yet because so many things are probably going to get overhauled. So in this case, you have people who believe that it is very important to be accurate because this is about to establish things from now until the end of time. An analog of this would be they actually have a weight, I believe it is in Paris, of some type of metal, and it represents exactly 1 kilogram. It is the standard for weight. Now, whoever made that probably had to be really, really careful when they manufactured it, because that could lead to all kinds of dramatic problems. Whereas a first attempt to make something, that's kind of like the first model you create before you actually open the one you really, really want. Okay, so let's see now what happened. Here you had conformity on about 35% of trials. What does that mean? So that means when I was the participant here, when I'm told that it's not that important through this idea of just trying to get used to eyewitness testimony, on the 7 trials where the 3 experimental accomplices gave incorrect responses, in 35% of those trials on average, I would likely conform to their response. So about a third of the time. Now, please note that that is just sort of how we're talking about this average. It does not mean that every single participant who came in conformed on 1/3 of trials. It could be that some conformed very little, some conformed quite a bit. What we're looking at here is just the average conformity across all participants and all critical trials was about 35%, or about a third of all trials. When it was really important, however, using others as a source of information can backfire, however, and that generally happens when the people we're using as a source of information to whose behavior we are conforming do not have correct information on how to deal with the situation at hand, or are simply just not experts in whatever it is that we are dealing with. It is, however, very difficult to know in daily situations when this is the case, especially in today's world where we see tons of information thrown at us, given to us by many people who are a mixture of gurus and self-proclaimed experts and scientists and doctors, and many of them oftentimes have conflicting opinions, and it's given to us in very quick snippets with situations that are often ambiguous to start with. And it can be very difficult to know which people to whom we are listening actually have valid information or not, and this can sometimes be problematic. While there is no way to truly know if this is ever the case, one of the best ways, I believe, to mitigate that effect is to get second opinions. Second opinions, not just for doctors' notes, but in general, if you hear something like this power tool is great, see if you can find that opinion somewhere non-related to the original one that was given you. And if a couple of different opinions tend to coincide, you're probably doing okay. So an example of this, just to show how crazy things could get, in 1938, War of the Worlds, which is one of the OG science fiction stories, if you're interested in that kind of thing, it was broadcast on the radio, because in 1938, that's probably how you would get a lot of your media. And this story has to do with, well, aliens invading. And it caused a really large-scale panic across this country because a lot of people thought that aliens were in fact invading the United States. Now, some people just missed the beginning of the show and they heard the story sort of halfway in the middle, and it was presented kind of just as their news anchors and media sources would provide such information over the radio. And because such stories were ultimately relatively rare at that point in time, it seemed like a regular radio broadcast, and a lot of people were confused by this and ultimately thought that it was true. There were other people who just listened to it with their families, and this fear began to feed on itself. And you have just now different individuals who are sitting together in a place, and a little bit of fear might rise here and there. And it is actually something that it is easy for us to pick up on other people. And this can oftentimes cause us to act slightly more fearfully, which sort of feeds this sort of group fear. You see this with sort of anger and violence also. It happens in protests and these kind of things, unfortunately, fairly often. It's so extreme, actually, that some experts actually thought this too. There was a person who called into the police, and the police actually believed the radio broadcast as well and told the person to just hunker down and, try and ride it out, so to speak, because, well, what are the police supposed to do if aliens invade? You know? I don't know. It's got to be pretty horrifying. But this is just a case of where the information that came through, to which we then based our behaviors on, ultimately was not accurate information, and relying on that inaccurate information led to maladaptive behaviors. Thankfully, no one burned down a whole bunch of stuff, because after a little while the radio show was over and regular broadcasting continued, and because none of the radio broadcasters thought anything was weird, a lot of people probably just calm down afterwards. So, when does informational social influence drive conformity? Well, there are three main things. The first, and probably the most important, is when a situation is ambiguous. Like I've mentioned a couple times over the last several slides, when we do not know what to do, we are more likely to look to others to try and figure out what the correct course of action is. Like mentioned before, though, please make sure those on whom you are relying to judge your new behaviors or correct actions in ambiguous times is not just exactly like you and sitting in a situation that they perceive as ambiguous. This is why so many times in emergencies, many people can ultimately just stand there. Many of them are looking around to others to try and figure out what the correct action is to do, and most of the other people are doing exactly the same thing, and ultimately the conforming now happens to this behavior, and you get a whole bunch of people who are just standing around looking at each other because everybody is trying to think or figure out what the correct course to do is. The situation is unclear, so no one actually has the tools to deal with it and knows the correct response, and thus are looking to others, and all of them are doing this, and so everyone collectively just stands there. As mentioned, when situations are crisis situations, it makes it very likely that we will use other people as a source of information in order to determine what the correct course of action is. Of course, crisis situations often happen to be ambiguous, so these two do go together. Now, a component that makes crisis situations even more likely to result in us using others as a source of information is that they tend to be quite fast-paced, and there's not a lot of time to actually stop and think through the situation and try and rationalize what the correct course of action is to do. Of course, under this is personal safety. When our personal safety is involved, ultimately you could classify that as a crisis situation for yourself, and the same rules apply. Finally, when those who are exerting this influence on us, either by our own choosing or just they exist in such a way that it applies on us, when those people are experts, we are much more likely to use them as sources of information for obvious reasons. They are experts. Now let's start talking about normative social influence. So this is kind of the other side of this social influence from informational social influence. Informational social influence was all about using others as a source of information because they ostensibly know how to act in a certain situation, and thus copying them or listening to them is a viable source of adaptive behavior. Normative social influence, on the other hand, has to do with how we are in groups of people and what we believe they want of us and will either do or not do to us if we don't conform to their group's norms. So first of all, social norms, it's important to know what these are, and these are the implicit or explicit rules a group has for acceptable behaviors, values, or beliefs of its members. So it goes across the board. There are certain things you just don't do, right? Like standing backwards in an elevator. There are certain values we're all meant to have. It is good to work hard, for example, and other types of beliefs. This is much more variable, but you can think of many different pockets and groups who espouse very specific types of beliefs, and either you believe those things and you're part of the group, or you don't believe those things and you can go elsewhere. Now, normative social influence is going along with what these people think or do, and this is generally in order to be liked and accepted by them. Now, liked and accepted don't always have to go together. Sometimes we need to be accepted by a group and we might not like them, and other times you just want to be liked by a group and you don't really care that much if you're accepted by them. But a lot of times you'll find both of these do go together. Now, when we tend to conform to normative pressures, it's much more common for us to publicly conform to those pressures and privately maybe not accept them. So one common thing of this will be that many people, for example, in religions like Islam, where you are not meant to drink alcohol, you will find many Muslims who, while they do follow many tenets of the Quran, do tend to also drink alcohol. and they will probably not drink alcohol around their more strict peers, or even sometimes during the month of fasting, for example. And much of this ultimately shows this sort of social normative pressure of you're not supposed to do that, but there's not necessarily a factual reason why you should or should not drink. I mean, you could say that for don't drink excessively because of the health damage, but informationally, there's not much you could say about one glass of wine a week here or there. That's much more of a normative social influence that does not fit with a group's values and therefore should not be done. Okay. Demonstrating normative social influence. So this is probably one of the more famous studies in psychology. Good to know about it. It's Asch's line judgment task. The researcher was, I'm not sure what their first name was actually. I think it actually might be Solomon. Anyhow, so a group of 7 people at a time were asked to take part in a perceptual experiment. So they all sort of were meant to take part in the experiment at one time. 6 of these people were experimental accomplices. So only one of the people who was involved as the quote-unquote participants in this experiment was a real participant. Everybody else was in on the experiment beforehand. Now, the actual participant was always the last one to arrive at the experimental sort of venue, and that should make sense because the accomplices are in on the experiment and so they're already there. Of course, they always made the person feel like they were the last one to get there. And they didn't do this to make them feel bad, it was because they wanted to control where in the room they sat such that the order of participants could be controlled. And so it was in this set of 7 seats that were along a table because they were about to be shown things, because it's a perceptual experiment. They always sat in the 5th or 6th seat. I think majority is actually the 6th, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So once they're all seated, they're sitting there. So I have, let's say I'm the sort of participant here, and I have 1 or 2 people on one side of me, and I have now 3 or 4 people on the other. And now I am shown a series of cards, and they kind of look like this. So the first is a standard, that's right here. So this is this one line that I'm shown, and then here are my comparison lines, and my task here is to indicate by number which of these 3 lines is the closest in length to the standard line. And hopefully you can see here that this was a pretty straightforward task. Now, accuracy rates are ridiculously high when you do this in individual persons looking at these tasks. There were a total of 18 of these, so 18 pairs of a standard line with 3 comparison lines, and they were all equally as easy. Now, on 12 of those 18 trials, however, all of the experimental accomplices, all of those who were in on the experiment, gave the same incorrect response. That's sort of like if this was one of the critical trials, this shows up, and I'm like, oh, it's definitely 2, but there are 4 people who are going to respond before me. And so I'm sitting there thinking, God, this was such a boring task, but yep, definitely 2. And the first person is like 3. And I kind of am shocked by this, like, oh, maybe you dozed off. And then the second person says 3. And then the third person says 3. And then the fourth person says 3. And then the 5th one says 3, and now it's my turn, and I know it's 2, but am I crazy? Maybe I should go with 3, right? That's kind of how it went. And 12 of the trials ultimately were like this out of the 18 trials. Those 12 are the critical trials, and let's now see what happened. So, on average, participants conformed, well, to different degrees. About 35% of people conformed on 1 to 3 trials. About, well, let's see, 12 to 15% of people conformed on 4 to 6 of those 12 trials. You actually had even more people, almost 18%, let's say, who conformed on 7 to 9 trials, and a little over 10% who conformed on 10 to 12 trials. This final bar right here shows that a little under maybe a quarter of people never conformed whatsoever. Here you can see the impact of just a group of people. The group around us, even if we don't know them, exerts this force on us. We have a natural tendency to want to be liked by those around us, And if all of them are expressing a certain type of opinion or viewpoint, it becomes more and more difficult to express something other than that when there is a high degree of agreement on some other way of looking at it that is different than my own. And you can see here that on a lot of trials, there are instances where many participants actually gave responses that were different than what they were looking at with their very own eyes. And one way that we know that this is in fact something that they simply said to be part of the group as opposed to what they actually believed is they conducted another version of this experiment, and this time instead of the participant giving their response out loud, they wrote down on a small piece of paper that no one else could see what they thought their response was. And in that version of this experiment, there was almost no conformity whatsoever. Nonetheless, this does show how groups can exert pressure on us to change our behavior, even when we don't ostensibly even know the group members. A more modern version of this has been conducted where they actually conducted this experiment in an fMRI. So this is a functional magnetic resonance imaging device. It allows us ultimately to look at function of the brain. Now, it also allows us to create very sharp and detailed images of the brain as well. So they were given a mental rotation task. A mental rotation task is where I'm given a particular type of shape, and then I'm shown some options that also have shapes in them, and I'm asked to pick out which of the options I'm given is the same shape as the original I was shown, just rotated in some way. Now, the first third of trials in this experiment were answered while the subject was in the fMRI scanner, and they were just answering on their own. So I was shown a shape, for example, if I'm the subject, and I pick out of A, B, or C, let's say, which one I think corresponds. And then I do this again and again, and I do this on a third of all the trials that will be in this experiment. Now, the average error rate, just in case you're curious, was about 14%. So about 14% of the time on these trials, people made mistakes. This is important to know because we want to know how much of subsequent trials might have been just because people genuinely made mistakes versus how likely are they to be conforming to the group. Now, for the remaining 2/3 of the trials, the participants saw the responses of 4 additional ostensibly participants, but these other 4 were actually experimental accomplices. And they would see on the screen that they were looking at inside the fMRI scanner because it's a very cumbersome setup. And they now also see, oh, okay, the other 4 chose A in this case, and I might think it's B, for example, or maybe I think it's A also. And on half of the trials of these remaining 2/3, so a third of all trials, these experimental accomplices gave incorrect responses. So just like Asch's original line study, you have a group of people who are giving unanimously an incorrect response. And so behaviorally, participants again conformed on an average of 41% of trials. This is actually quite similar to Asch's original line studies. And then they looked at brain activity for these different types of trials. So for the first set of trials, these are these up here where they had no feedback whatsoever. It's just them responding by themselves. There was very high activity in the posterior brain regions. This is probably what you would expect if you're used to that kind of brain imaging because they're looking at sort of visual stimuli, and then also some of the parietal region is a lot of, or has a lot of involvement when we're doing spatial reasoning tasks. And so a mental rotation task is likely to have high degrees of activity in those brain regions. Now, for the third of trials, when they conformed, or when they were conforming to the incorrect responses, there was very similar brain activity. But when they resisted, when they did not conform, while there was activity in those regions, there was high activity in both the amygdala and the right caudate nucleus. Now, you don't have to know where these are in the brain. What is important to know, I suppose, is that oftentimes amygdala activity is associated with either discomfort or a high need for salience. and the right caudate nucleus is oftentimes associated with when we are trying to modulate our own social behavior. And so you can see it is actually, from brain activity wise, much more intensive to resist a group than it is to simply conform with them, which is kind of crazy. It might be one of the reasons why we see such a high degree of conformity across the world. But then again, it could be the other way around, where conforming over the eons has actually been highly adaptive, and when we resist conformity, it oftentimes results in a threat to our own survival, and that could be why there's such high brain activity in these regions. I just say it both ways like that, just to raise the point of a lot of times people will see these kind of brain imaging or neuroimaging studies, and there is a bias of thinking that these are just sort of the gold standard scientific piece that demonstrates everything. And a lot of them are really cool and amazing, and sure, that might be the case, but the truth is many neuroimaging studies are ultimately correlational at their basis, and you cannot make causal claims, right? It is not necessarily the conformity itself that is causing this activity or vice versa, rather just these parts of the brain are associated with the behavioral actions in those times. That's kind of a side, I suppose. Going back to the importance of being accurate. So previously we talked about a crime lineup study. This is where they were shown a face for a half a second and they had to pick it up out of a lineup. So they, for this variant, made the task much easier so they could begin to see the effect of normative social influence. So here the participant themselves could see the face that they were supposed to pick up out of a lineup for 5 seconds. And then they got to see the face for another 5 seconds. And previously it was half a second, so you didn't get necessarily a good view of the face, and you genuinely relied on others to remember or fill in the gaps of what you might not remember. In this case, you saw the face for a full 10 seconds, which is probably enough for you to get a pretty clear image of that face, and therefore you probably don't have to rely on others as much to help you figure out who the correct suspect was. To demonstrate that, response accuracy was now as high as 97% when doing this task by themselves. When they did do this with 3 other accomplices present, they found that in the low importance group, participants conformed on about a third of trials, and this is very close to what they found in that previous variant of this study. On a third of the time, participants just conformed to the group. Now, it's pretty nuts to think about because chances are these people have a pretty good idea of who the correct person actually was, having seen the face for a full 10 seconds, and they still went along with the group. In the high importance condition, however, remember the high importance condition was this is going to be used as the benchmark for all future eyewitness testimony cases. Here, participants only conformed on about 16% of trials, compared to the 51% of trials on that previous variant, where now they had only been shown that face for half a second and actually had to rely on others for information. Here, they didn't have to rely on others for information, and it was much more important, and you see that there's actually lower conformity than the low importance condition, which does make sense because here it is more important to actually be factually correct and perhaps caring about what other people in a group of people around you who you technically don't know, having them like you is probably less important now than being accurate. Thus, conformity rates drop here. Some consequences of resisting normative social influence. So the most common thing when group norms are violated is sort of a 2-stage effect. You'll oftentimes see other group members who are still involved in the group try and bring this anomalous person back into the fold. It can often be by discussions with them. What are you thinking? Why have you changed your mind? What led you to this? Oh, don't you think the original things were better? Blah, 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 blah. It can also be through teasing or signs of frustration and irritation. So, how could you be so silly to believe that? That's just ridiculous, so on and so forth. If that is unsuccessful for an extended period of time, often social exclusion will result. And this is just you are no longer welcome in that group anymore if you continue to violate their norms. Also, just an extra piece on why this happens to be so important. For human beings, we are very social creatures, and not just because we're social creatures, but also because much of our evolutionary history, being excluded is an unbelievable punishment. When we existed as hunter-gatherers, it is unlikely most of us could have survived as solitary hunters. We would have needed other people to help us, watch over us while we slept, help us while we were sick, even deal with food and winters and those types of things. So social exclusion is actually one of the longest running and most sort of significant punishments that can be administered to a person. A little bit about when people will conform to normative social influence. So there's actually a theory that talks specifically about this called social impact theory, and it posits that this will be determined by 3 variables. First, how important the group that is applying normative pressure is to us. And this is oftentimes referred to as strength. And the more important a group is to us, the greater pressure there is on us to conform to whatever their values or beliefs are. Further, how close that group is to you has another strong impact on when we will conform to their values and norms. And this is often referred to as immediacy. And it's easy to imagine in one's own life, if we don't always agree with our parents' wishes for us, it is easier to defy them when we are far away from them than when we live in the same house. Finally, the number of individuals who are in the group that is applying normative pressure. Now, generally speaking, it tends to increase conformity as the group increases, but there are some nuances that we are now going to talk about on the next slide. Oh, here, let me move this out of the way. So when it comes to the group itself, group size, so increasing the size of a group has a greater effect on rates of conformity when that group is small. It has less of an impact when that group is large. In fact, many studies have found that increasing groups beyond 4 or 5 individuals doesn't actually increase conformity that much. As far as I know, no studies have been done on very large scale sort of group conformity. And I don't know if that is the case, say, if it, let's say, increases a lot between 2, 3, 4, and 5, it doesn't really increase much between 5, 6, 7, and 8, and then stays pretty flat until you get to a group of, let's say, 1,000. But maybe at groups of 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, all unanimously expressing some opinion, it might be different. But as far as I know, like I said, no studies on that have been conducted. The homogeneity of the group's opinion matters a lot. By this I just mean, are they all expressing a similar or the same even opinion, or does the group have a mixture of opinions? When the group is unanimous in their opinions, it increases the odds and likelihood of us conforming to that group's opinions. In fact, in Asch's line study, so in the study where you had to compare 2 sets of lines, we find that when there is one additional accomplice who does not respond in the same way as the group, who gives the actual correct answer, that conformity rates drop from an average of 32% to 6%. Finally, the culture of the individuals has an impact on the degree of conformity. So there is evidence to show that there's different rates based on culture. At a broad level, it tends to be higher, or the rates of conformity tend to be higher if group cohesion is something that is highly valued. Now, this is not as simple as saying collectivist cultures have more conformity than individualistic cultures, because a replication of Asch's line studies was done in Japan, and they actually found that there were lower rates of conformity in the Japanese sample than a North American sample. And a bunch of work was done on this, and one of the reasons put forward was that the Japanese sample, they were grown, or they live in a culture in which cohesion is very, very important. Conforming to your group is also extremely important, but conforming specifically to your group is what is important, and there's almost no requirement to conform to groups who are not your own. And in this case, those groups are largely created of family units or neighborhood units, so on and so forth. While in the North American sample, even though to some degree that is the case, there was actually higher pressure to conform to just general strangers than there was in Japan. So the degrees of conformity are impacted by culture, but they are nuanced as well. On that, some people have actually put forward the idea that it is related to a society's food gathering strategies. So this is probably not so much the case anymore, where many people in industrialized worlds are able to go to the supermarket. But the idea here was that those who come from historically hunter-gatherer type societies tend to actually conform less and not have such high group cohesion values, while those who tend to be more agrarian and farm-based tend to have much higher levels of conformity. And some people argue that this has to do with the general style in which these types of foods were gathered, and both of these social behaviors were adaptive for those particular types of situations. I personally don't know one way or the other, but do think it is an interesting idea. When it comes to safely defining the group, there is something called idiosyncrasy credits, and these are ultimately just they're not real credits, but it is the idea of a tolerance a person earns over time by conforming regularly to a group's norms, and if one does that regularly enough, that you're occasionally able to violate those group norms and not be kicked out or ridiculed from the group. Of course, the ratio of this is different depending on what group is involved, but yeah, it is the case where occasionally someone is able to deviate without severe ramifications, but that is only the case if it is a rare thing. If they are consistently defying the group in this way, the chances are that they will not be forgiven for it over time and will be excluded from the group if they do not bring their behavior back in line with that of the group itself. Minority influence refers to the case where a minority of group members may influence the behavior of the majority. In order for this to happen, two things must be present in the minority itself. So the views that the minority expresses must be expressed consistently. This means that they cannot be only along certain times of the year, let's say, or only during certain political climates are these opinions expressed, but rather they must be expressed continuously throughout the time that the minority is trying to change the opinions, behaviors, or beliefs of the majority. Further, the minority itself must have consistent views. This is probably one of the hardest things in overcoming, such that minorities can then influence change, because even though they are called minorities, many minorities tend to be made up of many individuals, and when many individuals are put together, they rarely all share the same opinions and views, though it does happen. In order for minorities to have a good chance to influence the majority, the minority must express consistent viewpoints along the lines of what they are hoping to change. Some just notes to take away from this. Majorities will oftentimes use normative social influence to acquire public compliance. You can think about this as because they are the overwhelming majority, they can simply decree things, and then all others who are living in that society must follow along with those guidelines, else there are ramifications like exclusion or tickets, or in some severe cases deportation and such things. Minorities will tend to achieve private acceptance through the use of informational social influence. Remember at the beginning of the lecture we talked about when good arguments with information are presented, this tends to cause us to change our private beliefs and not just conform to them in public situations. It is rare, generally speaking, that a minority can influence the majority with sort of normative social influence. They just don't have the social clout, if you will, to be able to influence the majority in that way. Finally, minorities will struggle oftentimes to get public compliance, And a lot of this is just due to image management related issues. And what I mean by image management related issues is oftentimes in order to get policy to change, policy makers need to be on board with it. And many times policy makers will be on board privately that they might agree in the privacy of their own home that a certain type of policy is a good idea. But because most of their constituents perhaps don't agree with it, they publicly will tend not to endorse such policies or ideas, and thus it can make it very difficult for minorities to achieve this form of public compliance, because now the policymakers themselves are not publicly endorsing it, which also leads their constituents to not actually endorse the opinions, or maybe they believe that most others don't and they don't feel comfortable either. And I mean, it ultimately has many different interacting variables, but suffice it to say, a huge problem that often confronts minorities when they're trying to change the majority is a lack of public compliance, and so, well, relatively negative behaviors can continue to perpetuate themselves. Moving on, a couple of terms to be familiar with before we go through the next couple of slides. Injunctive norms are the norms that refer to people's perceptions of what behaviors are approved or disapproved of by others. So these are sort of the rules that we have of the world, how we define what is good and what is bad. Those would ultimately be injunctive norms. So examples here would be that littering is considered bad and donating blood is considered to be a good thing. Now, these are contrasted with descriptive norms, and descriptive norms refer to people's perceptions of how people actually behave in given situations, regardless of whether the behavior is approved or disapproved of by others. So this refers to what we actually observe or experience in the world at large. So many of us, especially those who live in cities, have seen that many people do tend to litter, and that actually it is quite rare to have people go and donate blood. So these two types of norms at any given time are almost always at play, and we will talk a little bit about how their interaction changes our behavior in the next couple slides. So let us look at the impact of these types of norms on how it influences our behavior. So a little bit about the setup of this experiment. So it was set up such that the participants in this study at first were probably not aware that they were taking part in this study itself, but these were people who were coming back from a library and were about to get into their cars. And each of them had had a flyer that was placed on the windshield of their car. And before you are wondering about how it is the experimenters knew which car belonged to the patron of the library, they probably did not. They just put flyers in all of the cars around the library. Finally, they wanted to measure what was the likelihood or proportion of people who came back to their cars and found this flyer, and what proportion of them were going to litter, or how many of them took that flyer and just threw it onto the ground. Now, it is possible, I suppose, that people could have put it in their car and then thrown it out the window at some other point, but for the sake of this experiment, we're defining those who littered as those who, before getting into their car, tossed the flyer on the ground, and those who did not litter are the ones who took the flyer and put it inside their car. Now, a few manipulations were done. So first, there were 3 groups, and all of these had an accomplice who was part of the experiment itself, who would approach and ultimately walk past the participant who was involved. And the control condition just had the accomplice just walk by. So the person was coming up to their car, they were looking at this flyer, and the accomplice kind of just walks past. In the condition that is defined for descriptive norms, what happened is the accomplice walks by and drops an empty fast food bag right in front of the participant who is trying to figure out what to do with this flyer. So this ultimately primes our descriptive norms of, oh, it makes sense that people litter. I just saw someone who littered, and that is something that happens in my city or town or so on. The final condition was to activate injunctive norms, and here the accomplice again walked past the car, except this time right in front of the car they stopped and picked up a discarded bag or fast food bag and threw it in the trash and continued walking on. And so in this case, they're ultimately priming that injunctive norm of it is bad or wrong to litter, and the way in which they did that was by signaling to this person that it is wrong to litter here, and I will go out of my way to pick up litter that is not even mine. Finally, they manipulated the environment around the car. So the area around the car was either completely clean, well, probably not completely clean, but very clean, let's say, or there was tons of litter all around the car. And they basically, the experimenters, just put litter all over the place, which they did clean up later, but they just put it all around the place to show that it was either a clean environment or a dirty environment. And so ultimately, a way to think about this is there are 6 different possible situations a participant could be in. They could be getting into their car while it is clean or while it's dirty around the car, and in each of those, there are 3 different possible actions the accomplice could have done. They could have walked past, they could have dropped litter, or they could have picked up litter. And now let's look at what actually happened. So we'll just turn on a pointer again. So let us look first at these 2 bars right here. So this is our control condition. They're saying the Confederate just walks by. That corresponds here to this control condition where the accomplice simply walked past the participant. And you can see that the orange bar represents what it was like when the environment around the car was clean, and the blue one what it was like when the environment around the car was dirty. And you can see that a little more than 35% in both cases of people threw that flyer onto the ground. So just by rough proportions, about a third of people. Okay, let's look at now what happened when the accomplice threw some litter on the ground in front of that person. When the environment was clean around the car, you can say that or showed that this dramatically reduced the amount of people who threw litter out on the ground. So in a clean environment, just throwing some trash on the ground in front of someone is actually making them less likely to throw their own litter on the ground, which is pretty cool, but in a long-term solution, probably not the best, because trying to get people not to litter by littering in clean environments and then cleaning up all that litter just so you can litter again in a clean environment is probably not very cost effective. When it was in a dirty environment, however, you can see that still quite a large proportion of people littered. It is a little bit less than when nothing was done at all, but it still sits pretty squarely on 30% of people ended up littering, which again is close to about a third of people. Now, what happened when the injunctive norm was primed? So this, if you'll recall, is when the accomplice walked past the car and actually picked up some litter that wasn't even theirs and threw it away. Now, regardless of whether it was clean or dirty, the orange or blue bars, you can see that there's a dramatic decrease in how many people littered. You can see from this compared to that. In fact, now there are actually less people littering in a dirty environment. Probably because, well, there are probably many reasons why, but just imagine yourself in this situation of you see yourself in a dirty environment and some stranger walks past you and actually picks up some of that litter. I mean, it is making you think of that person, of the norms involved, of whether you should throw garbage, what kind of person are you, and what kind of people are all these who threw litter, and are you going to be like those people? And I'll let you continue that thought for yourself. The main takeaway from this is that the use of injunctive norms can change our behavior regardless of the environment we are in, while descriptive norms tend to only change our behaviors in some environments and not others. Okay, sometimes there is this thing called the boomerang effect, so I'll just turn this off now. And the boomerang effect refers to the idea that when we use norms to change behavior, that those who are performing better than average on whatever this sort of behavior is may begin to actually perform worse. So one of the most common examples that gets used of this is on universities to combat underage drinking or excessive drinking. They will post flyers that have the average number of drinks students drink per week, and it has actually been found to reduce people's drinking if their drinking is more than that average. But for people who drink less than that average, they will actually tend to increase the amount that they're drinking every week because they realize now that they're not drinking as much as normal. A more empirical example to look through this. So a group of houses here in California were divided into two groups. So you can think of this as like all the houses in a zip code, for example, and they were divided into those who were above average electricity consumers and below average electricity consumers. And so here the goal would be to be a below average electricity consumer and to try and move those who are above average to start using as much electricity as the originally below average consumers are, and to keep the below average electricity consumers consuming about the same amount of electricity. So what they did after they had gathered this data is they randomly assigned these households to receive one of two different types of feedback. So the first set were told how much energy they themselves had used, along with what the average use per house in their neighborhood was. So this would be just a descriptive norm being applied. So what we're doing here is you're basically giving them the information we measured before. You're using so many kilowatt hours of electricity and you are at the 37th place compared to the average, or you're using 1,000 kilowatts of hour per or energy per month or week or however it was, and the average is using 2,000 or something like this. Now, the other group were given that same information. They were told what their usage was, what the average usage was, but they were also given an injunctive norm, and they were given this through the use of smiley faces. So people who did not do well did not get a smiley face. People who were doing pretty well, meaning they weren't using that much electricity, got a small smiley face, and people who were actually using much less than the average got two smiley faces. And everybody got to see all three of these responses, and you just got a little tick mark next to the ones that were yours. Now, what did they find? They found that when it was only the descriptive norm, that those people who used less electricity than average actually started to use more electricity, and the ones who used more electricity than average did end up using less electricity. So we were able to change over consumers and bring their consumption rates down, but we also made low consumers increase their consumption and become less efficient with their electricity. So kind of a double-edged sword thing here, and you could place bets, I guess, on which one made a greater difference, but ideally that might lead you in law of averages back to where you started. However, the use of smiley faces, the use of priming an injunctive norm along with the descriptive norms was uniformly effective. It made people who were above average consumers use less electricity, and those who were below average consumers maintain their usage. Now, just a quick note on how the smiley face primed an injunctive norm. They did so by expressing approval or societal approval, or in this case, corporate approval of that behavior. That they were defining it as a good behavior that was achieved by the people who were below average electrical consumers. Some other tactics of social influence. First is this notion of the foot in the door technique. And so this comes originally from the idea of traveling salespeople who, as long as they could get one foot in the door, could ensure that you could not shut it on their face and they could keep telling you about their product. Probably not the most effective way to sell things, but this is where the name comes from. The way this works is you try to get people to agree to some small request, and then you ask them a larger request later. It has been found that if someone has done something for you in the past, it increases the likelihood that they will do something again for you in the future. We haven't talked about this yet, but I think Benjamin Franklin is credited with saying this, and it is, A person who has done you a favor is more likely to do you a favor in the future than someone for whom you have done a favor. As weird as that is to think about, a lot of evidence has actually borne that out. So back to the foot in the door technique, what we're ultimately saying is you get someone to agree to something small. Oh, could you pick up some salsa while you're at the store? Maybe you don't even care about the salsa itself, but it is just a way for you to lead up into a larger request later. Would you go out of your way and stop by at Costco and buy me some salmon and some ribeye and some paper towels, and also why not a generator? Now, maybe that will be too grand a request right after the small one, but on average, people will be more likely to agree to large requests after they have agreed to some smaller request first. In contrast to this is the door in the face technique, and this is kind of the opposite of the foot in the door technique. And this works by asking someone some completely outrageous request, like, will you build me a car from scratch, just right here, right now, and please don't go home or sleep or anything until it's completed. Of course, that's an over-exaggeration, but just imagine some grand request. Now, you probably already know that that request is not going to be accepted, which is okay because you don't actually want that. What you do is, after they say no to the outlandish request, you make your real request, which is smaller than that original outlandish request. And what oftentimes will happen is, because people feel either bad about not acquiescing to your request or not being sort of accommodating, that it will increase their chances of accepting this smaller request after they have said no to some larger request, even if that larger request is somewhat outlandish. Please be careful for both of these in the use or in sort of general day marketing usage. It happens much more than you would think. Finally, we have propaganda. So propaganda is the deliberate and systematic attempt to advance a cause by manipulating mass attitudes and behaviors, often through misleading or emotionally charged information. So this is kind of what we mean specifically by it, but ultimately when we're talking about propaganda, we're talking about some type of government or institution, or in these days it's actually corporations even that have the power to influence huge amounts of the masses. But ultimately what is happening is that one is providing a systematic set of information to the populace at whole to sort of modify their attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. Now we'll talk a little bit about this on the next slide some more. So when we are talking about propaganda, it is by far and large the most effective when it taps into a pre-existing belief that exists. It is very hard with propaganda to just spontaneously make a group hate or love someone if they have no opinions on it whatsoever. Also, it is pretty hard with propaganda to make somebody love a group that they collectively disliked or vice versa. It is theoretically possible, but tends not to happen very often. Instead, it is much more common to find sort of pre-existing biases, which isn't that hard because human beings have many of those biases, and then one can exacerbate those biases through the use of propaganda. Finally, when there are times of crises, people are much more likely to conform to the information provided by others. Remember, we were talking about ambiguous situations in the beginning of this lecture, and when it comes to propaganda, it is often always presented by someone who is said to be, at least, an expert. And they then present information in times of crises, and many of us are more likely to believe it in those times, and ultimately that results in an internalization of that propaganda at higher rates than if we're in a time of peace and contemplation and so on and so forth. Finally, the facts provided oftentimes in these types of endeavors, it's very hard to know if they're true. Further, true facts themselves can be presented in ambiguous ways that lead to conclusions all over the place. For those of you who are interested, one very good example of this is in the 1990s in Britain. There was an update from the Gen 2 to Gen 3 contraceptive pill, it increased the likelihood of getting certain types of blood clots by what was defined then as 100%. But in actual proportions, it only increased the likelihood from 1 in 7,000 to 2 in 7,000, which is a 100% increase, but probably that did not offset the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of babies, I think it's actually thousands, who were born 9 months to a year later, and then the cost of that on parents' lives and infrastructure. Now, okay. So, the final section we're going to talk about today is obedience to authority. A lot of this is going to be about Milgram studies, so please note that this section is somewhat unsettling, and if you need to take breaks, that's totally okay. If you would like to rather read about it than listening to me talk about it, that is also okay. It is a little bit disturbing, but it is one of those things in psychology that has kind of become one of the hallmarks of, or famous studies, let's say. Okay, now that I've given you a chance to pause and cut out, let us jump into it. So, how was this study set up? So here we're going to talk about just the basic structure of these studies. So a subject arrives for the experiment and they are introduced to another subject. So these subjects were anywhere between their 20s and 50s, and they came from all types of occupations. While the original study was conducted only on men, subsequent replications were done on women and found remarkably similar results. So, this other subject who they were introduced to was actually an experimental accomplice. So they were in on the experiment and they were always there first. So the experiment was supposedly designed to test memory and learning, and they were now going to be randomly set up to be either the learner or the teacher. And so the learner, it was their role to memorize a set of word pairs like blue box or nice day, and the teacher was the one who was going to be actually asking the learner then what is the sort of paired word with blue, and the learner should then say box, and then the teacher would say, okay, well, what's the paired word with nice? And the learner would say something like night, and the teacher would be like, nope, that is wrong, and so on and so forth. Now, because the subject or one of the subjects was an accomplice, they could control which sort of totally blank there. Which sort of role the actual subject was going to take. And so the actual subject was always assigned to be the teacher. And so they sort of did this by the experimenter had two pieces of paper, supposedly with learner and teacher written on both, that they would let the participant actually choose, except both said teacher really, so no matter what hand they chose, they were always the teacher. Okay, then the learner was taken into a separate room, so this was the accomplice, right? And they would now communicate with the teacher, who was the actual subject, via a microphone and push buttons. So they could communicate back to the teacher, they could talk through this system, and the learner would push buttons on which of the potential 4 multiple choice options given to them by the teacher was the correct word pair for the cue that they had been given. Okay, finally, the actual experimenter, so this was Milgram in the original studies, so they remain with the teacher, so the actual subject, throughout the course of the experiment. So the teacher or the subject is sort of sitting there at this contraption, which we'll talk about some more, that also had then their sort of microphone and their piece of paper for what are the right answers, and the actual experimenter just sort of stood next to them, and the experimenter was wearing a white lab coat, and this was conducted at a very prestigious university. These two things will become important when we start talking about some of the variants of this study. Okay, you can take a moment to pause here and just sort of picture all of this in your mind, just because it will help as we carry on. So, what happened when the learner made a mistake? Well, they got a punishment. And it was the teacher's job to administer this punishment. And so remember, the teacher is the actual subject in this experiment, and the learner is an accomplice. So The punishment consisted of an electric shock, which is pretty harsh, but, well, that's how it was at the time. Every time the learner made an error, the shock punishment would be increased by 15 volts. So on the first error, it's 15 volts. On the second error, it's 30 volts. On the third error, it's 45 volts, and so on. Failing to respond counted as an additional error. So let's say that the teacher asked a question and no response was given. That would be counted as an incorrect response. A punishment shock would be given, and then on the next error, it would be an additional 15 volts on that shock. So hypothetically, the learner could stay quiet for the entire exam and just keep getting higher and higher voltage shocks. The entire range of voltages ranged from 15 to 450 volts. So just for perspective, the mains in the United States are 120 volts. Some countries use 240 volts. Oftentimes, heavy-duty appliances like washing machines will go as high as 360 volts. 450 volts is a lot of voltage to end up getting shocked by. Finally, this was all done through a shock machine. So it was this machine with little levers and switches on it, each for one additional increment of 15 volts, and they could be clicked down as each of the sort of shocks had been given. And here I will show you a picture of what that looked like. So this is what the machine looks like. You can see here, let me turn on the little pointer again. So these are the little levers. All of these have been administered, in this case probably only for the picture, and the last remaining shock has yet to be given of 450 volts. Note that there are ranges given up here where the actual voltages are written on this machine, and because many of us are not comfortable with voltage, they actually gave signs down here to indicate how strong those shocks were. So here you can see it's slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, and we're only halfway there. It then turns red, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, followed by 3 X's. I will leave it to you to imagine what those X's probably mean. Okay, at this point, it's probably a good idea to think for yourselves, especially if you have not come across this experiment before, what you would do in this situation. Well, it gets wilder than that. So, as the experiment goes through, they had, of course, scripted the learner's protests. And now, because the learner is in a different room, you can do all kinds of fun things, like actually have them communicate to the teacher via tape recording instead of actually being there. And what that ensures is that every subject or participant actually hears the same amount of things. And also, it is important to note that this learner was never actually truly shocked. They were not actually hooked up to a real shock machine. And of course, that was not told to the actual participant. So this section here, you can kind of read what happened. Some of it is pretty rough. And here you can see that at 75 volts, the learner started to protest. So this is probably after the 15th error. Remember, 15, then 30, then 45, then 60, then 75. So here they make some signs at 90 again, at 105 it's a little bit louder still. At 120 volts, this is out of the mains, right? Hey, this really hurts. It keeps going, making signs. At 150 volts, they start to express concern about this experiment. They actually say to the effect, my heart is starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. My heart is starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out. Of course, it keeps going, and so that gives you an idea of how far some people actually went administering these shocks. Screams a bit more about let me out, can't stand the pain. At 195 volts, heart's really bothering this poor person. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out. At 210 volts, actually calling out to the experimenter, get me out of here. I've had enough. I won't be in this experiment anymore. more grunts and screams. At 270 volts, there's what is called an agonized scream. So we have all watched enough Hollywood to know kind of what this sounds like, screaming about "let me out of here." 285 volts, just simply a scream. At 300 volts, again, screaming, absolutely refuse to answer anymore. "Get me out of here, get me out of here, you can't hold me here." I mean, at this point, they're really starting to sound like a prisoner who's being tortured. At 315 volts, I told you, refuse to answer, I'm no longer part of this experiment. Finally, "Let me out of here, let me out of here, my heart's bothering me, let me out of here, I tell you." They're now hysterically screaming, by the way. If you would like to look up these transcripts or actual audio recordings, you're more than welcome to, but they're pretty rough. Okay, so what was the experimenter doing during all of this time? Well, they were giving one of 4 prods to the actual subject. So whenever the subject kind of showed sort of hesitancy, didn't want to go on, asked questions to the experimenter would start by saying, "Please continue," or "Please go on." If that didn't work, then they would give this second prod where they would say, "The experiment requires that you continue." If that didn't work, they would give the third prod, which is, "It is absolutely essential that you continue." If that didn't work, they gave the fourth prod of, "You have no other choice, you must go on." If that didn't work as well, the experiment would be stopped. But let's say the experiment or the actual subject carried on after hearing prod 2 and then became hesitant again later on, they would start at prod 1 again and then go to prod 2 and prod 3 and so on and so forth. You can read the rest of this too for some special instances that may have happened. Okay, so at this point in time, what is going on? A participant showed up. They thought they were going to be involved in a memory and learning experiment, and instead they have now sat down and they are testing some other person on their memory, and they're administering electric shocks to these people, and they're hearing basically the agonized protest of the person who is getting shocked. Now, what hopefully is on everybody's mind right now is, how many people shocked the actual person? Well, no actual person got shocked, right, because no one was hooked up, but how many people administered some shocks? What was the average amount of voltage that people shocked with? And how many people went to the very end? Well, let's find out. So, when it came to the punishments, the average shock administered by subjects was 360 volts. Which is pretty crazy. That means they went at least 2/3 of the way up flicking those buttons. This is probably the most widely reported statistic of this experiment, but 62.5% of subjects administered the final shock of 450 volts. This is almost 2/3 of people came in, and because of an experimental condition, in their minds at least, probably killed people. Administering that amount of shock to people is not necessarily safe. Finally, 80% of subjects continued to administer shocks after hearing about the learner's heart condition. So this is at about 150 volts, right, where this happened. Now, at this point, this is probably a little bit, it's probably a lot discomforting, because this is basically saying that some random person in a white lab coat at a fancy university can simply tell people to just shock people or do all kinds of crazy things, and a lot of people will actually listen to this. And what happens a lot of times when people are confronted with this information for the first time is they tend to seek sanctuary in the notion that these people were somehow deranged or broken or malicious, and that is simply not the case. Most of these were just average people. And again, I'm going to post a little script from Milgram himself about a subject. It is, again, pretty rough, so if you want to just forward through that slide, you're more than welcome to. But what Milgram said about one of the participants who came in is that he observed a mature and initially poised businessman enter the laboratory smiling and confident. Within 20 minutes, this person was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck who is rapidly approaching the point of nervous collapse. He constantly pulled on his earlobe and twisted his hands. At one point, he pushed his fist into his forehead and muttered, "Oh God, let's stop it," and yet he continued to respond to every word the experimenter said and obeyed till the end. There are videotape recordings of the debriefings of some of these patients. They're very hard to watch, but if you are in doubt that these are not normal and feeling moral human beings, you can watch that and you will see that these people felt unbelievable amounts of remorse for what they had just taken part in. Okay, probably want to take just a minute to take a deep breath here because, well, when you really think about this, it is kind of terrifying. Okay, let's talk about some variants. So, when it comes to modifying sort of the normative social influence, so what people around are okay with and not okay with, right? What their behavior is. So a variant was conducted in which there were 2 additional teachers. So these were people who took part in actually administering the test to the learner who was still sitting in a room ostensibly hooked up to a shock machine. These 2 teachers were also, of course, accomplices. But what happened this time is, at 150 volts, the first teacher refused to take part in the study anymore, and the second one refused to take part after 210 volts. So basically imagine yourself as the actual subject. You see yourself sitting with these 2 other subjects and you're going along, and the first one cuts out at 150 saying, "I can't do this anymore," and the second one at 210 volts is like, "Nope, cannot do this anymore." In that case, rates of conformity were about as low as 10% compared to the 62% in the original. Right? We went from 2/3 of people administering almost the full shock to people down to 10% or 1 in 10 people. That is a dramatic decrease in the rate of conformity. And so this just goes to show having some accomplices, like we talked about in Asch's line studies, makes a huge impact on how likely we are to resist conformity. If we are the only one who is trying to resist, it makes the likelihood of successful resistance much, much lower. Okay, when it comes to modifying informational social influence, so here ultimately the experimenter standing in that white lab coat at that prestigious university was a source of information because they were the ones who kept saying, "Please continue, please continue." You had an authority figure who was also an expert continually asking you to carry on. And so in this ambiguous situation, we are pretty likely to follow the rules of someone who is supposedly an expert. Right? If there's a huge fire going on and a firefighter tells you to do something, chances are you're not going to think about it that much and just do what they say. Right? Okay, so here's a variant in which they modified that. Here, the setup is pretty much exactly the same as the original was, except after sort of the experimenter says hello and all of this, they have to leave the room to attend some phone call. And there's a second teacher, right, who is just another accomplice, but they're, as far as you know, just another person like you, someone who randomly took part in this study because you answered an ad and are just a regular human being. Now, the experimenter only said, you're going to administer this test and that's kind of it, but gave no instructions about the shocks or the punishment. And what actually happens is that second teacher, who's supposedly another person like you, gave all of the initial instructions. Okay, how about we give an additional shock each time they make a mistake, blah, 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 blah. Here what happened is conformity rates dropped to about 20%, which is a great drop, right? We went from 62% in the original all the way down to 20%, but it is pretty crazy to think about that even in this case, a full fifth of people administered that final shock at the behest of some random person who was taking part in this study as well, who ostensibly had no more expertise than the subject themselves. Yet in the nature of such an ambiguous situation, people still relied on that other person as a source of information, even though they were neither an expert nor an authority. Okay, finally, Just some things to keep in mind. So nothing the learner ever did caused a decrease in conformity. They could yell, scream, mention this, that, or the other, and nothing really changed. On that note, as far as I know, in all of the replications done in these studies, there are only a handful of people that could be counted on both of our hands, if in fact maybe only one hand, of people who refuse to even give the first shock. Almost every single person who has ever taken part in all of the iterations of the Milgram studies has shocked other human beings to some degree at least. Finally, this is not something that is about aggression. So this was done with a variant in which the subjects themselves were allowed to administer whatever shock they wanted. They could freely choose this, and in that case, only 2.5% of subjects actually administered that final shock. So that is very different than the original 62%, showing that while some people might be okay with this, most people are not going to go with such a high degree of shock. Okay. So there are some ways to reduce conformity, but ultimately it shows that in an authority figure, in a situation where it is ambiguous, we will rely on others to either condone or not some type of behavior, and largely we will go in line with what those recommendations are. Remember that 62% of people who flick that final switch. Now, this was conducted 40, 50 years ago, so maybe there's hope. We live in a world of much more information, and times have changed, and we're more individuals now, and we take part in democracy, and yada, 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 right? Well, study conducted in this vein was conducted in 2009, and it took a long time to finally do more of these studies just because it was very unethical, the original ways that this was conducted. And we're not going to talk too much about that here, but if you're curious about it, it's something worth looking into. One of the biggest parts that people struggle with today along those ethics, people were not necessarily screened, they were not given good debriefings, and they were effectively traumatized, which is something we are no longer allowed to do in research. Okay, so some modifications were done to the original Milgram studies to make this more ethical. First, the study stopped after the punishment corresponding to 150 volts. While all switches were present, at 150 volts, if that shock was administered, they would stop the experiment. The reason they did this is they had found from the original variants that people who went past 150 volts were just very likely to go all the way up until the end, and so the assumption was made that if people hit that voltage, they'll likely go to the end also, and there's no need for us to traumatize our participants to such a degree. Also, all subjects who took part in this modern variant were pre-screened by a clinical psychologist for any types of predisposition to trauma or stress or psychoses and these types of things. And ultimately what they were trying to make sure is that the people who took part on this would not be severely psychologically damaged. They also were then debriefed with the psychologists. So approximately 40% of people were excluded from taking part in the study because they were deemed unfit in some form. Finally, subjects were told repeatedly that they could stop at any time, that at any time during the experiment they were free to stop and leave without any detriment to their standing with the university or pay or any such thing. This is true in all modern psychological studies. You can come in, sign a consent form, get up, walk out, and we cannot do anything to you because that is how it goes. Nor technically should we want to do anything to you because all humans have a right to choose whether they want to participate or not, at least in research. Okay, for the sample of people, approximately half of the people who took part in this modern variant were college educated. 20% of them actually have advanced degrees. They were more ethnically diverse than the original samples. There were a lot of European Americans in the original samples, whereas these reflected more of population distributions. Finally, any who had taken a psychology class previously were excluded because this gets talked about in, so many psych classes that chances are they were aware of what this study was about. Okay, I had already mentioned that they stopped the study after 150 volts because it had been found that those who went past this point were very likely to administer that final shock. So what happened with our modern sample? Well, at the 150 mark, 70% of participants were ready to continue administering that shock voltage. So, time has not seemed to have made much of a difference. It is sobering. Finally, a few other reasons why we obey. One is this idea of conforming to the wrong norm. So there's not only one norm active on us at any given time. Oftentimes we're under the pressure of many different norms at any given time. So in the conformity studies that we were talking about, two different norms were ultimately at conflict. One norm of obey authority, which is probably one of the most fundamental norms that all of us have. We all learn it from our parents, we learn it from our teachers in school, from police officers. I mean, there's pretty much nowhere you can go where listening to authority is somehow not a norm. This is, of course, now in conflict with the norm to do no harm, right? Now you're continually shocking people, but you have an authority figure who keeps telling you, no, that's okay, keep doing it, while you're also like, well, I don't want to hurt people. I'm not someone who hurts people, but I'm also not someone who disobeys. And so one is kind of stuck. And in those situations, it can be difficult which norm to follow, and we will occasionally follow incorrect norms, especially in situations, again, that are ambiguous, that have time constraints. It just becomes very hard to actually think about what's going on and which norms we are following, right? The studies might have been very different if between each shock participants had 10 minutes to think about what they were doing, as opposed to please move on to the next question as soon as possible. Another is self-justification, and this refers to the idea of we're not necessarily looking at each new action in an isolated way, but we're looking at it in comparison to the previous action. So here it is very shocking that people went all the way up to 450 volts when we hear about it in a lecture like this. But if you think about what was going on for the participant, it wasn't just 450 volts came out of the blue. It was 15 volts each time, right? So you've just given someone 200 volt shock and they've made another mistake and you're like, okay, well now it's 215, but I did just give them 200 volts and 215 isn't that different from 200. And then they make another mistake and now you're like, oh shit, I have to give them a 230 volt shock. Well, that's not that different than 215, and so on and so forth. This is often the type of argument that gets used with sort of gateway drugs, of you can use one small drug at first and then you can use something slightly stronger and slightly higher dosage and so on and so forth, and it becomes easier and easier to increase our usage, but it never seems shocking to us because we're always comparing this new uptick in usage to our previous usage, not to where we were when we just started. If you think a little bit deeply about one's own life, you can find evidence of this type of self-justification in many of our behaviors. And they don't all have to be bad, right? Exercise has tons of positive self-justification. You know, I did 14 push-ups yesterday, I can do just one more today. And if you keep doing just one more every few days, there will come a time where you will be able to do 100 push-ups. And if you just randomly are told do 100 push-ups, it sounds insane. But if you keep doing it one more every so often, before you know it, you will be at 100 push-ups, only ever having done one additional push-up each time. Finally, there is the loss or displacement of personal responsibility. And so this is the idea that one cannot be held directly accountable for one's actions because you were ordered to do it by somebody else. A common place in modern day life where we find evidence of this all the time is prison guards, who are the ones who are meant to administer death penalties to people. Many of them don't perceive what they're doing as murder, even though they are taking somebody else's life. It is not murder to them because they're not the ones who are quote-unquote choosing to end this person's life. They are simply enacting the will of society. Now, this is exacerbated even more when you have large groups of people. This is one of the fundamental pieces that oftentimes gets talked about with the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. Even though such atrocious things were done, no one person could be held accountable for every single action that took place. The people at the various concentration camps were listening to their supervisors were listening to their own supervisors who were managing products in this way and that way, and ultimately people were so far removed that they were no longer directly involved in what was going on, and this type of sort of division ultimately makes it so that no one person is actually responsible, and so we can always place our own actions on somebody else, which is a convenient way ultimately of getting around looking at our own actions. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Thank you for your attention. Sorry I could not end it on a happier note. I will just say, please sort of pay attention for these types of things. Just because someone is wearing a fancy coat doesn't mean they are right. And more often than not, even though we think there might not be time, there is a little bit of time to stop and think. I'm not saying do that in every situation that is an emergency, but where at all possible, it is good to stop and think. Thank you again.